Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Alistair and to Invest Northern Ireland for the invitation to speak today. My name is Jonathan Walsh, and I'm a director of 40 Insight, which is a Northern Ireland based customs, trade, and strategic advisory business. I've spent nearly 30 years in business, including close to 20 years working in senior international trade roles within industry. And on the 4th of July this year, I will reach 10 years working as a trade, customs, and strategic advisor, supporting manufacturing, engineering, and wholesale businesses trading across borders and jurisdictions. So, much of the last decade of my work has been shaped by some of the biggest changes to UK and EU trade in generations. Initially, that involved helping businesses prepare for Brexit and the new Northern Ireland trading arrangements. And then, since the beginning of 2021, a significant part of my work has involved helping businesses navigate the practical realities of operating under the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Windsor Framework, and across and between UK and EU systems. In practice, that means helping businesses understand not just the policy position, but how those rules operate commercially and operationally in the real world. Alongside supporting businesses directly across the UK, Ireland, the European Union, and beyond, I actively engage with HMRC and other UK government departments, as well as their Irish and EU counterparts. I also participate in a number of trade industry and Queen's University led steering groups and stakeholder forums focused on customs, trade, and Northern Ireland's unique trading arrangement. That combination of industry experience, advisory work, and stakeholder engagement provides a useful perspective on how these changes are developing in practice. So, before we begin today, it's important to set some expectations. Today's session is intended as a practical briefing based on the published position as of June 2026. Given the breadth and complexity of the topic and the fact that implementation continues to evolve, this webinar cannot provide definitive advice for every business or scenario. The position for any business will depend on factors such as the products involved, their origin, the routes they take, and how those goods are used or processed when they enter Northern Ireland. But instead, my objective this morning is to help businesses understand the changes coming into effect, identify potential areas of exposure, and recognize where further review may be appropriate. And why does that matter? Although today's session focuses on steel, many of the themes we will discuss extend beyond steel alone. Increasingly, businesses are having to think about sourcing, origin, supply chain resilience, customer expectations, and competitiveness. And nowhere is that more relevant than here in Northern Ireland. To understand why these changes matter as much here, we first need to understand Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor framework. Before we get into steel specifically, it's important to step back and understand why Northern Ireland is different. Under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland occupies a unique position unlike anywhere else in either the UK or the European Union, in fact, in anywhere in the world. Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom's customs territory. However, under the Windsor framework and previously the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland also continues to benefit from access to the EU single market for goods. In practice, this means that Articles 30 and 110 of the TFEU, Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, continue to apply in the United Kingdom with respect to Northern Ireland. It also means that Northern Ireland continues to align with certain EU customs rules and regulatory requirements in relation to goods. This unique position is often referred to as Northern Ireland's dual market access. For many businesses, that creates significant opportunities, but it also creates complexity. Because when goods enter Northern Ireland from outside the European Union, and that includes Great Britain, those goods may be considered at risk of entering the EU single market. And where goods are considered at risk, EU customs rules, tariffs, and trade measures apply, including EU tariffs, tariff rate quotas, also known as TRQs, safeguard measures, and trade remedies such as anti-dumping duty. In practice, if you bring goods into Northern Ireland from Great Britain or from a country outside both the UK and EU, import information must be submitted to HMRC, either directly or through an intermediary such as the Trader Support Service. Whether duty is payable depends on a number of factors, including the origin of the goods and whether they are considered at risk of entering the EU. Importantly, some goods cannot be declared as not at risk. Where goods are subject to certain EU trade remedies, including safeguard measures such as steel TRQs or anti-dumping duty, they are treated and known as Category 1 goods and are automatically deemed at risk under the Windsor Framework. For steel importers, this point is critical. It means that EU trade measures remain highly relevant in Northern Ireland. And it is for this reason that specific internal UK trade mechanisms such as the use of NIREM under UKIMS are outside of the scope of today's webinar. The key message for you attendees is this. Northern Ireland businesses operate at the intersection of UK and EU systems, and because of that, route and origin matter more than ever. So, with the foundations in place, let's now look specifically at why steel has become such an important area of focus in both the UK and the European Union. Having considered Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor Framework, the next question is why steel? The answer is that steel is not just another product category. Globally, steel is regarded as strategically important industry and as a result has been subject to trade defense measures for many, many years. In fact, many of the steel measures businesses are dealing with today have their origins back in 2018 during President Trump's first term in office within the US. When the United States imposed Section 232 tariffs on steel imports, the European Union became concerned that steel originally destined for the US market could instead be diverted into Europe, and the UK was part of the EU at that time. In response, the UK introduced steel safeguard measures, including tariff-free quotas, designed to protect EU producers from import surges and trade diversion. Those measures have evolved over time and remain a key feature of the European steel landscape today. For some Northern Ireland businesses, steel trade measures are not new. For most Northern Ireland businesses involved in steel trade measures are not new. Since 2021, businesses importing certain steel products into Northern Ireland from Great Britain or directly from countries outside both the UK and EU, the rest of the world, have already had to navigate EU trade measures under the Northern Ireland Protocol and subsequently the Windsor Framework. This has included import declarations, EU tariff rate quotas, safeguard tariffs, and where applicable, anti-dumping duty on some products from certain origins. That's because where goods entering Northern Ireland are considered at risk of entering the EU single market, EU customs rules and trade measures continue to apply. To recap, because this is critically important, where goods are subject to EU trade remedies, such as steel safeguard measures, they are treated as Category 1 goods, which automatically considers them at risk under the Windsor Framework. So even if a trader is registered, authorised for UK Internal Market Scheme, even if they say that they are trading or if they are only trading within the internal United Kingdom market, they have additional requirements, evidence requirements when they trade B2B. In any case, when a good is Category 1, i.e., there is trade remedies attached, those goods are automatically at risk and as such are requiring they go through these import declaration requirements such as tariff rate quota checks, and so forth. But there's also a second group of businesses that may now become affected. Since 2021, many Northern Ireland businesses have been importing products, materials, and components from Great Britain that were not themselves subject to EU steel measures. Whilst these businesses have been living with import declarations and customs processes, they may never previously have had to think about steel tariff rate quotas or trade remedies directly. The tightening of UK steel measures, however, from the 1st of July 2026 may now change that indirectly. Many Northern Ireland manufacturers purchase products and materials from suppliers in Great Britain. They have done from the very beginning for generations. In no supplier face those if so those suppliers, i.e. their suppliers in GB, face tighter UK quotas, higher costs or reduced availability, those impacts may ultimately be felt through increased prices, supply constraints, longer lead times, and sourcing decisions for the NI businesses indirectly impacted. In other words, even businesses that have never had direct exposure to steel safeguard measures may increasingly feel the effects through their supply chains. At the same time, businesses importing steel directly into Northern Ireland from countries outside both the UK and EU may increasingly need to consider both UK and EU trade measures simultaneously. This is one of the clearest examples of Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor framework. And what's the key message for you here? Historically, many Northern Ireland businesses focused primarily on the EU trade measures. But from the 1st of July, businesses may increasingly need to understand both the EU and UK measures, because whether directly through customs exposure or indirectly through their supply chains, they may be impacted. So, why are governments acting now? Having looked at why steel matters, it is useful to step back and consider why governments around the world are increasingly intervening in this area. The measures we are discussing today do not exist in isolation. Across the world, governments are increasingly focusing on their supply chain resilience, industrial strategy, trade defense, and strategic autonomy. As this slide highlights, we are seeing growing use of trade defense measures, including safeguards, anti-dumping duties, and origin controls. At the same time, customer expectations are also evolving. Increasingly, businesses are being asked not only where products come from, but also for information relating to origin, emissions, traceability, and wider supply chain visibility. For businesses, this means that steel is no longer simply a customs issue. Increasingly, it becomes a commercial issue. As highlighted on the right-hand side of this slide, this may increasingly influence procurement decisions, route selection, supplier visibility, documentation quality, and ultimately competitiveness for the business. But Northern Ireland's businesses may be particularly well placed in this environment because they've already operated at the intersection of UK and EU systems for the last 5 years or so. So again, what's the key message from this slide? Businesses that understand both operational systems and commercial expectations may be better positioned than they realize. With that wider context in mind, let's now look specifically at what the UK is changing from the 1st of July 2026 and why that matters for Northern Ireland businesses. Having looked at the wider global context, this slide brings us specifically to the UK measures, due from just over a week away on the 1st of July. There are 3 points to take from this slide. Firstly, the UK is reducing many of its steel tariff rate quotas, which in practical terms, means less steel may be able to enter the UK tariff-free under the relevant quota categories. Will be, it's not maybe. Secondly, where quota has been exhausted, imports above the available quota may now face a 50% UK safeguard tariff. In the past, it was, or currently, it is 25% out of quota tariff. Whilst obviously 25% was significant, reduced quota and a doubling of the out of quota tariff rate becomes much more than customs technicality. It will undoubtedly directly affect landed costs, pricing, purchasing decisions, and supply availability. Thirdly, as already covered, the policy objective is linked to wider concerns around global steel overcapacity, trade diversion, and protection of the domestic steel sector. For Northern Ireland businesses, the key point is not simply whether they personally import steel directly into Northern Ireland, as some businesses will have direct exposure, particularly where they import steel directly from the rest of the world into Northern Ireland. But for many more businesses, they will be affected indirectly. If GB stockholders, distributors, or suppliers face tighter UK quotas, higher costs, or reduced availability, those pressures can flow through to Northern Ireland's customers in the form of higher prices, longer lead times, reduced choice, or changes in sourcing strategy. That is why the bottom message on this slide matters. Northern Ireland businesses still interact with EU safeguard requirements, depending on route and origin, but UK measures now also matter because they can shape the GB supply market that many NI businesses buy from. So, the key point is this: UK steel measures may affect Northern Ireland businesses both directly through customs exposure on rest of the world to NI imports, but also indirectly through supply chain cost, availability, and pricing. UK measures are only half the picture here. We also need to look at what the EU is changing, because for Northern Ireland businesses, EU steel measures remain highly relevant under the Windsor framework. We've just looked at the UK position. However, for many Northern Ireland businesses, EU measures remain the more directly relevant customs consideration under the Windsor framework. As we've already discussed, where goods entering Northern Ireland are considered at risk of entering the EU single market, EU customs rules and trade measures continue to apply. This is particularly important for steel, as TRQs mean automatically at risk status. The first message from this slide is that the EU is tightening its steel safeguard framework from the 1st of July. The framework has progressed through the EU legislative process and will replace the existing safeguard arrangements. Whilst final publication detail and implementation guidance continues to emerge, the direction of travel in the EU is clear. Tighter quotas, greater monitoring, and increased scrutiny of origin and supply chain. The second point is that imports above the relevant country-specific or global quota may face a 50% safeguard duty, similar to the UK out-of-quota tariff. For businesses importing steel directly into Northern Ireland from countries outside the EU, including Great Britain, quota availability and quota timing may therefore become increasingly important. And this is where Northern Ireland becomes unique. Unlike businesses operating solely in Great Britain, Northern Ireland businesses increasingly find themselves operating between evolving UK and EU steel regimes. That doesn't mean every Northern Ireland business will face direct customs exposure. However, businesses here should increasingly understand where their products originate, how they move, whether trade remedies apply, and how changes elsewhere in the supply chain may affect them commercially. The final point on this slide is perhaps the most important in the longer term. The EU direction of travel extends beyond tariffs. Increasingly, we are seeing focus on supply chain traceability, trade defence enforcement, carbon reporting and CBAM, origin verification, including concepts such as melt and pour, and wider product standards and strategic resilience. In other words, this issue is no longer simply tariffs. Increasingly, it's about visibility, traceability, and understanding your supply chain. So, what do Northern Ireland businesses need to do or take from this? Northern Ireland businesses may increasingly operate between evolving UK and EU steel regimes, making route, origin, and supplier visibility more important than ever. So, having looked at both the UK and EU changes, let's now turn to why Northern Ireland's position under the Windsor Framework makes these developments particularly unique. Having looked separately at the UK and EU measures, we now come to the question that really sits at the heart of today's webinar. Why is Northern Ireland treated differently? The answer is that Northern Ireland operates at the interface of UK and EU trade systems under the Windsor Framework. Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom's internal market and customs territory, but at the same time, under the Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements, Northern Ireland continues to have access to the EU single market for goods, and it aligns with certain EU customs and regulatory rules in relation to goods as a result. This unique position is often referred to as dual market access. For businesses that creates opportunities, but it also creates complexity. The key point is that when goods enter Northern Ireland from outside the European Union, and in this case that includes Great Britain, they may be considered at risk of entering the EU single market. Where goods are considered at risk, EU customs rules and trade measures apply. For steel products, this is particularly important. EU steel safeguard measures, such as tariff rate quotas and, where applicable, anti-dumping duty, are treated as Category 1 goods under the Windsor Framework. These goods are therefore automatically considered at risk. That means that EU trade measures remain highly relevant for Northern Ireland importers. The left-hand side of the slide highlights movements from the European Union. Where steel is already in free circulation within the EU, movements into Northern Ireland are generally more straightforward from a safeguarding perspective. On the right-hand side, we have Great Britain. Goods moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland operate under the Windsor Framework arrangements. UK origin steel benefits from specific UK NI quota arrangements agreed under the Windsor Framework for certain sensitive categories. However, origin remains critical. EU origin steel moving via GB is treated differently from rest of world or UK origin steel moving via GB. And this brings us to perhaps the most important point in the presentation. Route and origin matter. The same steel products can produce very different operational outcomes depending on where it originates, the route it takes, and whether it is considered at risk of entering the EU. And in the case of Category 1 goods, they are automatically at risk. The position becomes most complex for direct imports from the rest of the world into Northern Ireland. In those scenarios, Northern Ireland traders may increasingly need to consider both UK and EU trade measures simultaneously from the 1st of July 26. This is because the goods are entering the UK customs territory, whilst EU trade measures also apply. That is why Northern Ireland is unique. Businesses have increasingly operated Businesses here are increasingly operating between two evolving systems. So the key message is simple. Different rules can apply depending on route and origin, and understanding those differences is increasingly becoming a commercial advantage. Having established why Northern Ireland is different, let's now look at where Northern Ireland has historically sat between UK and EU steel regimes and how that position is evolving since the 1st of January 2021. We've established why Northern Ireland is different. So this slide illustrates how Northern Ireland's position has evolved over time. Historically, under the Northern Ireland Protocol and subsequently the Windsor Framework, many Northern Ireland steel movements interacted primarily with EU trade measures. That's because with goods entering Northern Ireland from outside the EU and are considered at risk of entering the EU single market, which in this category is anything Category 1 steel is considered at risk automatically. EU customs rules and trade measures apply. As a result, Northern Ireland businesses importing steel have, since January 1st, 2021, often focused on EU tariff rate quotas, EU safeguard measures, and things like anti-dumping duty and other trade remedies. However, the position is now evolving. From the 1st of July, Northern Ireland businesses may increasingly find themselves operating between two evolving steel regimes: an evolving EU steel regime and an evolving UK steel regime, a more hands-on UK steel regime. That does not mean every business suddenly faces maximum exposure. Exposure continues to depend on route, origin of the product classification, and supply chain structure. But increasingly, businesses will need visibility across both systems. For some businesses, this may mean direct customs exposure. For others, the impacts they face will be indirect through their suppliers, their sourcing decisions, and market pricing. The key message from this slide is that Northern Ireland increasingly sits between two evolving systems. Understanding how those systems interact is becoming increasingly important for businesses operating across and between UK and the EU markets. So, with that context in mind, let's now look at the root logic itself and why the same steel products can create very different outcomes depending on how it enters Northern Ireland. This is another key slide in my presentation because it translates policy into operational reality. If there's one message I would encourage businesses to take away from today's session, it is this: the same steel products can create very different outcomes depending on route and origin. Under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland businesses cannot simply look at a commodity code in isolation. Businesses also need to consider: where did the product originate? How is it moving? Which customs environment is interacting with it? And what trade measures may apply? In this slide, I've tried to set out four simplified movement scenarios. We've got the green, the orange, and the red, the traffic light type system, and with the blue in there as well for GBNI. So starting on the left-hand side, movements of steel from the European Union into Northern Ireland, that is steel that is in free circulation in the EU at the time of movement, are generally the most straightforward from a safeguard perspective. As we move across the slide through Great Britain and into the rest of the world, the level of complexity and potential exposure increases. Why? Because routing through Great Britain does not remove origin. A product originating in China, India, or another rest of the world country doesn't suddenly become UK origin simply because it passes through Great Britain. And this is particularly important for steel. For example, EU origin steel entering Northern Ireland via GB reseller is generally treated differently from either UK or rest of world origin steel moving via Great Britain. Similarly, direct imports from countries outside both the UK and EU into Northern Ireland may increasingly require businesses to consider both UK and EU trade measures simultaneously. This is one of the clearest examples of Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor framework. The key point is that route, origin, and customs treatment increasingly interact. And because of that, businesses can no longer simply ask, what is the commodity code? They instead need to be asking, what's the commodity code? Where did this product originate? How is it moving? What declarations are required? And which trade measures might apply? Operational understanding itself is becoming very commercially valuable. The businesses best placed to respond are often those that understand their supply chains before disruption occurs. So let's now walk through each of these scenarios in turn and see how the same steel products can produce very different outcomes depending on the route it takes into Northern Ireland. Let's start with what is generally the lowest complexity movement scenario from a steel safeguard perspective. EU origin steel, or steel that is in free circulation in the EU at the point of sale and the point of movement to Northern Ireland. Here, steel is moving directly from the European Union into Northern Ireland. Where steel is already in free circulation within the European Union, EU safeguard measures such as tariff rate quotas have either already been addressed, either because the steel is EU originating or where it is of rest of world origin, because the relevant customs formalities and trade measures were applied when it was originally imported into the EU. As a result, UK safe measures do not typically apply, and movement from the EU into Northern Ireland are often more predictable from a customs and trade remedies perspective. That doesn't mean businesses should ignore wider developments. Increasingly, customers and supply chains are seeking greater visibility around origin, traceability, emissions, and supplier information. However, from a steel safeguard perspective, this is generally the simplest route. The key message from this slide is straightforward. Not all steel movements are impacted equally. Route and origin matter. So let's now look at what happens when Great Britain is introduced into the supply chain. This next scenario introduces Great Britain into the supply chain. This is a scenario many Northern Ireland businesses will recognise, particularly where they purchase steel from stockholders, distributors, or resellers in GB. The key point here is that the route has changed. The goods are now moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, so an import declaration is required for the commercial movement. However, where the steel is EU originating and that origin can be properly evidenced, EU safeguard quota checks should not generally be required again, simply because the goods are moving via Great Britain. That distinction is important. This is not the same as saying that any rest of world origin steel that was previously in free circulation in the EU can move through Great Britain into Northern Ireland without further consideration. That's a different technical discussion and not the focus of today's webinar. For today's purpose, the practical point is this. EU origin steel moving via GB is generally treated differently from UK or rest of world origin steel moving via Great Britain, in that whilst there is a requirement to complete an import declaration, when you get to quota, you use the NIQO code if you're doing this yourself through TSS, NIQUO, but in the description box, you simply state EU origin and you hold the evidence to meet this or to prove this. A declaration requirement does not automatically mean quota exposure, but the origin position must be supportable. So let's now move into UK origin steel, moving from GB into Northern Ireland, where the specific UK NI quota arrangements become relevant. Our third scenario looks at UK origin steel, moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. This is where the Windsor Framework specific arrangements become particularly important. Under the Windsor Framework, specific UK to Northern Ireland tariff rate quotas arrangements exist for certain steel categories, recognising Northern Ireland's unique position. Originally, these arrangements applied to a more limited number of sensitive steel categories. However, over time and as agreed, the scope has expanded to include additional product categories. Nevertheless, there are two important points to note. Firstly, these arrangements apply only to specific steel categories and are subject to quota availability. And secondly, they are not unlimited. As with any tariff rate quota, once the available quota is exhausted, the position changes. For businesses purchasing UK origin steel from Great Britain, this means that procurement, timing, product classification, and quota availability become increasingly important. It also reinforces a wider theme running throughout my presentation and today's webinar. The same steel product can create very different outcomes depending on its origin and the route it takes. Whilst this scenario is generally more straightforward than rest of world origin steel via GB, reseller, or direct imports from the rest of the world, businesses should not assume that quota interaction is just a tick box exercise. Key message is from this slide is simple. This is not unlimited exemption. Quota management still matters. So far we've looked at steel in free circulation in the EU, EU origin steel, and UK origin steel moving from GB to NI. Let's now move into what is often one of the most complex scenarios, rest of world origin steel moving via Great Britain into Northern Ireland. We're now moving into what is often one of the more complex scenarios. Steel originating in a country outside both the UK and EU, but moving into Northern Ireland via Great Britain. The key point here is that routing through Great Britain does not change the underlying origin of the steel. A product originating in China, India, Turkey, or another rest of the world country does not become UK origin simply because it has passed through Great Britain or is being sold by a GB supplier. And that distinction is extremely important. Unlike UK origin steel moving from Great Britain, which may benefit from specific UK to Northern Ireland quota arrangements agreed under the Windsor Framework, rest of world origin steel moving via GB into Northern Ireland is instead subject to EU country-specific or EU global tariff rate quotas. Depending on the country of origin, these goods may also be subject to other trade remedies, including anti-dumping duty. When these goods move from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, an import declaration is required, and EU trade measures will apply as the goods are considered at risk of entering the EU single market automatically as Category 1 goods. Increasingly, businesses therefore need visibility of country of origin, supplier information, product classification, and wider supply chain arrangements. This is particularly important because where trade remedies apply, the origin of steel may be just as important as the route it takes. Key message. Routing through Great Britain does not remove origin exposure. Where steel was produced can be just as important as where it was purchased. The final scenario we're going to look at today is direct imports from the rest of the world into Northern Ireland. And this is where Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor Framework becomes most visible. Our final scenario looks at direct imports from countries outside both the UK and the European Union. This is generally the highest exposure and most commercially sensitive scenario. And it is here that Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor Framework becomes more visible. Why? Because goods entering Northern Ireland directly from the rest of the world are entering the United Kingdom's customs territory as well. However, when these goods are considered at risk of entering the EU single market, EU customs rules and trade measures also apply. For steel importers, that means businesses may increasingly need to consider both UK and EU trade measures simultaneously. This is particularly important because steel safeguard measures are treated as Category 1 goods under the Windsor Framework and are automatically considered as at risk. As a result, depending on the product and country of origin, businesses may need to consider UK safeguard measures and tariff rate quotas if they apply, EU safeguard measures including country-specific and global tariff rate quotas, and, where applicable, other trade remedies such as anti-dumping duty. Unlike businesses purchasing steel from GB suppliers, direct importers into Northern Ireland often encounter these exposures immediately and visibly at import stage. Many importers bringing products into Northern Ireland from Great Britain are using the TSS service and are completing supplementary declarations by the 10th day of the month following the movement. And therefore, at that point, the goods have already moved. Quota could have, will likely have changed. Availability of quota may no longer be there. And that's why it's important for those declarations to be completed as quickly as possible. But for rest of world to NI movements, the import is normally done at the point of movement, and as such, that exposure is immediate. It's also worth noting that the UK quotas tightening from the 1st of July and the EU framework evolving Businesses importing directly into Northern Ireland may increasingly need visibility across both systems. The key message from this slide is therefore direct rest of world imports into Northern Ireland may require businesses to navigate both UK and EU trade measures at the same time. And that is one of the clearest examples of Northern Ireland's unique position under the Windsor framework. So we've looked at where exposure may arise. Let's now turn to some of the support mechanisms available to Northern Ireland businesses under the Windsor framework. Having looked at the various trading scenarios and where exposure may arise for importers in Northern Ireland, it's important to recognise that Northern Ireland does retain some unique support mechanisms under the Windsor framework. And this slide highlights three in particular. The Customs Duty Waiver Scheme, also known as CDWS, the Duty Reimbursement Scheme, DRS, and announced last month and updated at the start of this month, the introduction of the new CDWS replenishment, the ability to replenish into your waiver allowance that you'd previously used declaring goods as at risk, where you then can produce, or you can now produce evidence to show that those goods did not enter the EU single market. All of these mechanisms can be valuable in certain circumstances. However, they are not universal solutions, and their availability will depend on the specific facts and circumstances of each movement. The Customs Duty Waiver Scheme may, subject to relevant conditions, allow eligible businesses to waive certain duties, EU duties on qualifying goods entering Northern Ireland. Similarly, the Duty Reimbursement Scheme may allow businesses to reclaim EU duty where they can demonstrate that goods did not ultimately enter the European Union. Recent changes to DRS and the introduction of the duty waiver replenishment provides businesses with additional options that may assist in managing EU duty exposure. That's the most important message in this slide, is the one highlighted at the bottom. These mechanisms relate to EU duty exposure. They do not remove UK safeguarding exposure. And this is particularly relevant for businesses importing steel directly into Northern Ireland from countries outside both the UK and EU, where UK trade measures may also come into play. You can't remove those UK tariffs if it's out of quota. As with many aspects of the Windsor framework, eligibility is highly fact specific. What works for one business or supply chain may not work for another. And the key message is this: these mechanisms can be useful tools, but they should be viewed as wider customs and supply chain strategy rather than a complete solution. Alongside these Northern Ireland specific measures, businesses may also wish to consider wider customs planning tools. Having looked at some of Northern Ireland specific support mechanisms, business may also wish to consider wider customs planning tools. However, it's important to stress that there is no single universal solution. Different businesses face different exposures depending on the products they import, where those goods originate, how they move, and how they are used within the business. This slide highlights two examples. First is customs warehousing. In certain circumstances, customs warehousing may allow businesses to defer the payments of duty whilst goods remain under customs control. Depending on the business model, this may support stock holding strategies, quota management, and cash flow planning. The second is inward processing. For some manufacturing businesses, inward processing may allow duties to be suspended where imported goods are processed and subsequently exported or otherwise discharged under the procedure. However, both procedures will require careful consideration, authorization, and robust record keeping. They are not suitable for every business or every supply chain. Getting authorization doesn't mean that you will make a successful claim, and that has been something I've seen several times with companies I've worked with. Increasingly, businesses should consider customs procedures as one part of a wider strategy that also looks at sourcing routes, supplier visibility, stock holding, resilience, and customer requirements. And this is where today's session naturally links to the next presentation from Invest Northern Ireland. Whilst I have focused primarily on customs trade measures and operational impacts, supply chain resilience extends well beyond customs alone. Stuart will shortly explore practical approaches to building resilience, managing supplier risk, and strengthening supply chains in an increasingly uncertain trading environment. The key message from this slide from me is this: commercial practicality is just as important as technical eligibility. So what do we already begin to see businesses do in response to these changes in UK and EU steel measures? As many of the changes we've discussed today are still evolving, businesses are already beginning to respond. And in many respects, this is not dissimilar to what we saw during Brexit and the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol back in 2021. Businesses do not always wait for every piece of legislation or guidance to be finalised before making decisions. Increasingly, we are seeing businesses here review their sourcing strategies, supplier relationships, stock holding levels, and procurement decisions. For some businesses, this may involve looking at alternative suppliers or routes to market. For others, it may simply mean asking more questions of existing suppliers. Businesses are increasingly seeking greater visibility around the country of origin, supplier declarations, mill certificates, and wider supply chain information. At the same time, customer expectations are also evolving. Businesses are being asked to provide information relating to origin, traceability, sustainability, and product information. And in many cases, commercial expectations can emerge before legal obligations do. And that is something we have seen repeatedly in recent years across customs, trade, and supply chain compliance. The key message: uncertainty itself can influence business behavior. Businesses that start asking questions now will be better positioned to respond as the position continues to evolve. And increasingly, these conversations extend beyond imports alone into exports, customer expectations, and wider supply chain considerations. So, what's happening downstream, and how is all of this impacting that and customer consequences? Conversations around steel is extending beyond imports and customs compliance alone. Businesses are not only being asked where products come from, but increasingly how they were produced and what evidence can be provided to support those claims. Northern Ireland's unique position means that it has access to both the UK internal market and the continued access to the EU single market for goods. And that remains a significant strategic advantage for Northern Ireland businesses. However, with that opportunity comes increasingly expectations around visibility and evidence. Across a range of sectors, businesses are being asked or are encountering requests for country of origin information, supplier declarations, mill certificates, emissions data, and wider supply chain traceability. In some cases, these requirements may be driven by legal requirements such as CBAM. In many others, they are being driven by customers, procurement teams, and supply chain expectations. And that is an important point. Commercial expectations often emerge before formal legal obligations do. We have seen this previously with areas such as sustainability, due diligence, and supply chain reporting. Import declarations can influence export opportunities and customer relationships. As a result, businesses may wish to think not only about the customs implications of their supply chains, but also how well they understand them. This also links closely to the next session from Invest Northern Ireland, again where Clive will explore wider supply chain resilience, supplier risk, and practical steps businesses can take to strengthen their operations. So please stay online for that. The key message from this side is this: dual market access remains a significant opportunity, but visibility and evidence are becoming increasingly important. So, with all this in mind, what practical questions should businesses now be asking themselves internally? Having looked at the evolving UK and EU measures, the question for businesses is not whether change is coming, because it already is. The more important question is, how exposed is my business and my supply chain? An answer to this question will be different for every business. This slide sets out some of the practical questions businesses may wish to consider. For example, do we understand the origin of steel or products we purchase? Or any of the products or materials subject to EU or UK trade measures such as tariff rate, quotas, or anti-dumping duty? How dependent are we on suppliers in Great Britain? What visibility do we have of our wider supply chain? Could changes to the UK or EU measures impact our costs, availability of materials, or lead times for those materials? For some businesses, the impacts may be direct through customs exposure, but for many, many others, it will be indirect through their suppliers, procurement decisions, and changing customer expectations. Importantly, businesses do not need to have all the answers today, but they should begin asking the right questions. Because in my experiences, businesses that understand their supply chains before disruption occurs are often the best place to respond when change comes. This is not simply about customs compliance. It's about resilience, visibility, and commercial preparedness. And once again, that links closely to the next session from Clive, where he will explore practical approaches to strengthening supply chains and managing risk. What's the key message? Businesses best positioned for change are often those asking the right questions before they have to. So, what are some of the most recent developments and changes businesses should already be aware of? I added this slide because it was striking to me just how quickly the position continues to evolve. Even since March 2026, we've seen a significant amount of change across both UK and EU systems. So this slide highlights some of the main ones. So some of the main developments have included publication of the UK steel strategy back in 19th of March, confirmation of changes to UK safeguard measures from the 1st of July, changes to the duty reimbursement scheme and the introduction of CDWS customs waiver replenishment in May, 26th of May, and then an update again in early June. Evolving EU steel measures and increasing customer and supply chain information requests. And I think that last point is particularly important. Increasingly, businesses are being asked not only where products come from, but also for information related to origin, traceability, and supply chains. One of the lessons Northern Ireland businesses have learned since 2021 is that operational practice can evolve alongside formal policy publication. In many cases, businesses had no choice but to begin adapting before every detail was fully settled. That is not unique to steel. We saw it during Brexit, we saw it during the Northern Ireland Protocol negotiations, and with the Windsor Framework. The key message from this slide is simple. The pace of change itself is increasingly becoming an operational challenge. Businesses that actively monitor developments and understand their supply chains are often better positioned to respond. So we're coming nearly to the end of my slides today. So with all that in mind, where does this leave Northern Ireland strategically as these UK and EU measures continue to evolve? As we approach implementation from the 1st of July, there remains a number of areas that businesses, policymakers, and industry groups continue to monitor closely. And I think it's important to be transparent about that. The broad direction of travel is clear. However, as with many areas of trade policy, and we've seen this and we've got used to this over the last couple of years. Some operational detail continues to evolve. The first area we are watching closely is how UK and EU steel measures evolve in practice following implementation. For example, how quickly are quotas utilised once these changes come into effect on the 1st of July in both UK and EU? Whether further guidance or clarification emerges, and how businesses adapt to sourcing and procurement strategies. Secondly, we continue to watch whether any Northern Ireland specific clarification or easements emerge, because we know Northern Ireland's unique position means that practical operational questions can sometimes arise as policy develops, and we've got the benefit of the joint committee on that. Thirdly, there is an increasing focus on origin, traceability, and customer information. This is particularly relevant for manufacturers exporting into international markets, where customers may increasingly seek evidence relating to sourcing, production, and supply chains. Finally, we continue to monitor how businesses themselves respond. One of the lessons Northern Ireland businesses have learned since 21 is that operational practice can evolve alongside formal policy publication. In many cases, the market moves before the legislation fully settles. And that is the key message from this. The position continues to evolve, but the need for businesses to understand their supply chains is already here. So, where does this leave Northern Ireland strategically? Throughout today's webinar, we've discussed complexity, and there is no doubt that operating under the Windsor framework can be complex. Northern Ireland businesses sit at the interface of UK and EU systems in a way that few other jurisdictions do. This can create challenges, but it can also create opportunities. Mitigate risks, maximize opportunities. Northern Ireland continues to enjoy a unique position with access to both the UK internal market and the EU single market for good. For many businesses, that's creating strategic advantages around market access, supply chain flexibility, and customer reach. Of course, that opportunity comes with responsibilities. Businesses need to understand where goods originate, how they move, what evidence they hold, and how evolving UK and EU rules interact. One of the observations I would make, having spent nearly 10 years helping businesses in this space, first to prepare for Brexit and then navigate the practical realities of Northern Ireland Protocol and Windsor Framework, is that Northern Ireland businesses have become remarkably adaptable. Since 2021, businesses here have been operating across and between UK and EU systems every day. That experience itself can become a competitive advantage. We have seen this repeatedly through periods of trade disruption. When markets become more complex or costly, some businesses choose to withdraw, reduce product ranges, or stop serving certain customers altogether. However, demand does not disappear. Often it simply creates gaps in the market that others are able to now fill. For businesses that understand their supply chains and can adapt to changing requirements, complexity can sometimes create new opportunities as well as challenges. Because whilst the legal architecture may not change dramatically, the commercial reality often does. And the businesses best placed to respond are often those that understand their supply chains, maintain visibility, and adapt early. And that links closely to the next session again from Clive, because resilience is not just about customs. It's about building supply chains that can adapt to change. Complexity is not always a disadvantage. In some cases, understanding complexity can become a real competitive strength. So my final key takeaways from today. If there are 5 things I would encourage businesses to take away from today's presentation, they are these. Root and origin matter. The same steel product can create very different outcomes depending on where it originated, how it moves, and which customs systems interact with it. Under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland sits at the interface of UK and EU systems. That creates both complexity and opportunity. Thirdly, This is broader than tariffs alone. Increasingly, businesses need to think about supply chains, traceability, customer expectations, and resilience. Fourth, visibility and preparation matter. Businesses that understand their supply chain, sourcing routes, and potential exposure earlier are generally better placed to respond to change. And finally, complexity can create opportunity. Northern Ireland businesses have spent the last number of years adapting to operate across and between UK and EU systems. That experience and that adaptability has created a competitive advantage. Ultimately, this webinar is not about predicting every possible outcome. It's about helping businesses better understand the questions they should be asking about their own supply chains. Because in an increasingly complex trading environment, operational understanding itself is becoming commercially valuable. Remember, businesses best positioned for the future are often those that understand their supply chains before disruption occurs. And to close, thank you for taking the time and coming along and engaging this morning. I appreciate this is a complex and fast moving area. My session was intended to provide a practical overview of the new UK and EU steel measures and what they may mean for Northern Ireland businesses. Given the breadth of the topic and the unique nature of Northern Ireland's trading arrangements, today's webinar could not provide definitive answers for every business or every supply chain. As we've discussed throughout the session, outcomes depend on product classification, origin, movement route, customs procedures, and how goods are ultimately used. My hope today is that the session has helped businesses better understand where potential exposure may arise, the questions they should be asking in their supply chain, and where further review may be appropriate. Whilst today's presentation is focused primarily on customs, trade measures, and operational impacts, resilience extends far beyond customs alone. And with that in mind, I will now hand over to Clive Stewart from Invest Northern Ireland Supply Chain Resilience and Development Solutions team, who will explore practical approaches to mitigating supply chain risks and strengthening resilience in an increasingly uncertain trading environment.